He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair.
This true crime documentary recreates a heartbreaking case that shocked the Croydon area and drew attention across London. Sally Anne Bowman was born on September 11, 1987, in Carshalton, South London. She was the youngest of 4 daughters of Linda and Paul Bowman and had a deeply close bond with her parents and sisters. Sally Anne was a cheerful, friendly girl who was always willing to help others. Despite her young age, she showed remarkable maturity, independence, and determination when she decided to move out on her own to pursue her career and dreams. Even after leaving home, she continued to visit her family frequently and never let too much time pass without seeing them. With a deep passion for the arts, Sally Anne attended the Brit School, a prestigious performing arts institution in England that has produced well-known names such as Tom Holland, Adele, and Amy Winehouse. Being accepted there was a great source of pride and a major step forward in her journey to chase her dreams. Alongside her studies, she worked diligently as a hairstylist and freelance model. In early 2005, she signed a contract with Pulse Model Management, a local modeling agency, and soon became the face of the Swatch watch brand. That April, Sally Anne participated in the Swatch Alternative Fashion Week, where she confidently showcased her radiant personality and unique style on the runway. With steady progress and unstoppable energy, the 18-year-old girl was on her way toward a bright and promising future. On the evening of September 24, 2005, 18-year-old Sally Anne Bowman was at her mother's home in South London. After a long and busy week, she simply wanted to relax that day. In the afternoon, her younger sister, Nicole, called and invited her to attend a close friend's birthday party. At first, Sally Anne hesitated, but with her cheerful and friendly nature, she quickly agreed. Around 6:00 p.m., she put on light makeup, chose a casual yet stylish outfit, and said goodbye to her mother. Linda Bowman never forgot that moment, when Sally Anne turned back, smiled, and said, "I love you," before walking down the driveway lit by streetlights. She met up with Nicole and their group of friends, and together they decided to head to one of their favorite bars in the center of Croydon. The last image of Sally Anne was captured on CCTV, showing her laughing, dancing, and enjoying the night to the fullest with her friends. As the party came to an end, Sally Anne and her sister Nicole left the bar and walked through Croydon's town center in the chilly early morning air. After saying goodbye to her sister, she began talking on the phone with her ex-boyfriend, Lewis Sproston, whom she had broken up with only a few weeks earlier. Although their relationship had ended, there were still lingering emotions between them, and Sally Anne wanted to meet him to talk things through. She took a taxi back to the Croydon area, where Lewis was waiting in his car. Around 2:20 a.m., he picked her up, and the two drove to Sally Anne's rented flat on Blenheim Crescent, just a few minutes away from her mother's house. During the drive, the atmosphere in the car was initially quiet, but unresolved tensions from their past relationship soon led to an argument. The conversation grew intense, lasting for nearly 2 hours. By around 4:15 a.m., Sally Anne decided to get out of the car in front of her house to end the discussion. Louis watched her walk away under the dim glow of the streetlights before driving off into the quiet neighborhood. A little after 4:00 a.m., while most of Blenheim Crescent was still wrapped in peaceful sleep, a nearby resident was suddenly awakened by a series of chaotic noises coming from the street. According to the witness, the sounds resembled a brief struggle, ending with a single scream that startled them upright. The person quickly got out of bed, walked to the window, and looked outside. But the street was completely silent, with only the dim yellow glow of the streetlights reflecting off the empty pavement. Seeing nothing unusual, they returned to bed, unaware of what had just taken place outside. Around 6:30 a.m. that morning, just as the sun was rising, a neighbor living near Blenheim Crescent stepped outside to start the day and noticed something unusual behind a construction waste bin by the side of the road. From a distance, they thought it was just part of a discarded mannequin, but as they moved closer, their unease quickly turned into overwhelming horror. It was Sally Anne Bowman, lying motionless right in front of the house she rented. Part of her clothing appeared disheveled, and signs indicated she had already been gone for a short time. The neighbor immediately called the police, and within minutes the area was completely sealed off. Forensic units, crime scene investigators, and the Serious Crime Task Force quickly arrived on the scene. That morning, when police knocked on the Bowman family's door, Linda Bowman initially thought that Sally Anne had simply forgotten her keys and was waiting outside for her mother to open the door. She walked out with a gentle smile, but the moment she saw 3 officers standing solemnly on the porch, her intuition went cold. One of them softly asked, "Are you Linda Bowman? Do you know someone named Sally Anne Bowman?" She nodded, replying that Sally Anne was her youngest daughter, the same daughter who had said, "I love you," just the night before. The officer then delivered the devastating news. Sally Anne had been found with no signs of life near the home she rented. Every sound around her seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of her own broken breathing. Linda later recalled, "All I could do was scream until my throat burned. I couldn't believe it. My whole world collapsed in that moment." After informing Linda Bowman, the police went to see Michelle, Sally Anne's older sister, to deliver the heartbreaking news. Michelle later recalled that the moment she heard it, it felt as if a part of her had left her body and would never return. "I felt empty," she said, "as if the world had suddenly lost all its color." Just a few hours after the official investigation began, Sally Anne's mother and sister had to face the most painful ordeal of their lives: the identification. When they entered the cold, sterile room of the morgue, Michelle said, "At first, I didn't believe it was her. Her hair looked darker than usual, and for a moment, I tried to convince myself that this must be someone else. But then I saw her little nose and those familiar freckles, and my heart just shattered." Linda, frail and exhausted, nearly collapsed at the sight of her daughter. Michelle, unable to contain her grief, held her mother tightly and cried uncontrollably, pleading over and over, "Mom, please wake her up. Please just wake her up." 2 days after Sally Anne was found, her family, still consumed by grief, made the difficult decision to meet with the police to better understand what had happened. Detective Chief Inspector Stuart Cundy and senior investigators visited Linda Bowman's home to share the initial findings. Based on the evidence gathered at the scene, they believed that only minutes after stepping out of Lewis Sproston's car, Sally Anne had been standing alone in the driveway in front of her rented home, less than 32 feet from the door, when she was suddenly and violently attacked by a man. Although the exact details could not yet be confirmed, the evidence suggested the assault had been swift and extremely aggressive. The young woman suffered severe injuries during the attack. Forensic experts also discovered signs of serious misconduct and collected crucial DNA samples, including biological traces left on the victim's body. These samples would later become key evidence that helped investigators identify the person responsible for the tragedy. The quiet peace of Croydon's suburban streets was shattered completely, and a dangerous individual was still at large, leaving the entire community gripped by fear. Right after the initial autopsy results were reported, police quickly turned their attention to Lewis Sproston, Sally Anne Bowman's ex-boyfriend. The fact that he and Sally Anne had argued on the night she was last seen alive, combined with him being the last known person to meet her, made Lewis the primary suspect in the early stages of the investigation. That same day, officers began searching for him and soon located Lewis staying with his brother and a friend. He cooperated fully, identified himself, and was taken to the police station for questioning. For 4 consecutive days, the special investigation team worked tirelessly, asking detailed questions to clarify what had happened on the night of September 24th. Lewis maintained his statement, insisting that he had no knowledge of the incident until police contacted him. To verify his account, investigators collected a DNA sample from him and sent it to the forensic laboratory to compare with the biological evidence recovered at the scene, in order to determine whether it matched the DNA found on Sally Anne's body. At first, all the evidence made the case seem straightforward, a heated argument between 2 young people that had ended in tragedy. However, just a few days later, when a call came in from the Forensic Science Service, FSS, in England, the entire direction of the investigation shifted dramatically. The DNA test results had finally arrived. The biological samples collected from the scene did not match Lewis Sproston. Instead, they matched an old DNA profile linked to a serious assault that had taken place in 2001, less than 1.2 miles from where Sally Anne's life was taken. The perpetrator of that earlier crime had never been caught, and the case had long been filed away as cold. Lewis was immediately released from custody and cleared of suspicion. This shocking discovery made investigators realize they were dealing with an extremely dangerous offender, someone who had not only committed serious crimes in the past, but also appeared to be escalating in violence over time. Now, the police were in a race against time, knowing that if they didn't find him soon, another tragedy could happen at any moment. The cold case from 2001, whose DNA profile had just matched, sent chills through the investigative team. At that time, a woman was making a phone call in a telephone booth near a Tesco supermarket parking lot when she was suddenly approached by a stranger. In an instant, he committed a severe and deviant act, leaving biological evidence at the scene before calmly walking away, leaving the victim in a state of utter terror. Although police had collected a complete DNA profile back then, no matching suspect existed in the system, and the case was eventually filed away as cold. For years, the perpetrator had remained free. Now, with that same DNA profile reappearing in the case of Sally Anne Bowman, investigators knew they were dealing with an extremely dangerous repeat offender. The biggest question was if he had committed a serious assault in 2001 and now another tragedy just a few streets away. Where had he been during those 4 silent years? And how many other victims might there be that no one yet knew about? Fear spread throughout the entire investigative team. Because if this offender truly was escalating, no one could predict where or when he would strike again. Shortly after the DNA results revealed the link to the old case, the investigators' worst fear became reality. Less than an hour before Sally Anne Bowman's tragedy unfolded right outside her home, another woman had been attacked in the Sanderstead Road area, just a few blocks away. The victim had been standing on the sidewalk, using her cell phone to call a family member, when a stranger suddenly approached her from behind. According to her statement, he only said 2 words, "I'm sorry," before abruptly attacking. The assault happened quickly and violently, leaving the woman terrified and screaming for help. Fortunately, at that very moment, a taxi drove past, startling the attacker and forcing him to flee. Before running off, he snatched the victim's phone. The call was still connected, and the person on the other end heard the entire incident, including her terrified screams and the chaotic sounds from the street. What deeply alarmed police was that in the audio recording, the victim's screams did not fade away, suggesting that the man had not run far, but was instead hiding nearby, possibly watching the scene unfold from the shadows. Fortunately, the kind-hearted taxi driver stopped immediately, pulled the victim into his car, and rushed her to the nearest hospital for medical care. Thanks to his quick response, the woman survived the attack and was able to recount in detail what she had seen. At the hospital, she provided police with a specific description of the man who had assaulted her, including his approximate age, build, hair color, and facial features. Using her testimony, the facial identification specialists from the British police created an EFIT, electronic facial identification technique, a digital composite sketch recreating the suspect's face based on the witness's description. Once the EFIT was completed, investigators immediately noticed that the witness's description bore a striking resemblance to the clues they had gathered in the Sally Anne Bowman case.
He's described as a white man in his 20s or 30s, between about 5'9" and 6 foot. He's of proportionate build, with short, dark hair.
The EFIT composite was widely released across television, newspapers, and bulletin boards throughout the Croydon area, generating hundreds of calls from the public. People sent in countless tips, ranging from individuals who resembled the image to vague suspicions. But unfortunately, none of them led to the breakthrough police so desperately needed. Realizing that the visual lead had reached a dead end, the investigation team decided to return to their most crucial piece of evidence, the DNA sample found on Sally Anne Bowman's body. Forensic experts confirmed that this was the single key capable of unlocking the true identity of the person behind this series of dangerous acts. Based on the location of the crimes and the suspect's movement pattern, investigators believed he was a local, someone deeply familiar with every corner of South Croydon and aware of the quietest hours of the night. From that theory, they launched an unprecedented large-scale operation, a community DNA screening. More than 6,000 addresses in the area were listed, and at each location, officers had to determine how many men lived there or had been present on the night of the tragedy. In total, Around 4,000 individuals matched the general profile. Although the chances of the perpetrator voluntarily coming forward and providing a DNA sample were almost zero, investigators held out hope that a relative, perhaps his brother, father, or son, might participate in the testing, allowing them to detect a genetic link that would ultimately lead them to the true suspect. Although the initial DNA screening campaign had brought hope, 6 months after the tragedy, the investigation began to stall. Thousands of samples had been collected and compared, yet none matched the suspect's DNA profile. The investigative team started to feel the heavy weight of time, each passing day making the chance of finding the perpetrator seem slimmer. Meanwhile, residents of South Croydon lived in lingering fear. Every evening, the once peaceful streets grew unusually quiet, as people worried that the person responsible for the heartbreaking case of Sally Anne Bowman was still out there, waiting for another opportunity. By March 2006, when all investigative leads seemed exhausted, police decided to change their strategy. They returned to a detail that had seemed almost forgotten: the E-fatigue composite of the man who had attacked a woman less than an hour before Sally Ann's ordeal. Upon re-examining it closely, investigators grew increasingly convinced that it was indeed the same man, the one likely responsible for both incidents on that very same night. As the investigation began to reach a standstill, police were forced to change their strategy. They decided to release a new E-fit composite. This time, an image reconstructing the face of the man responsible for the telephone booth assault in 2001, whose DNA matched perfectly with the DNA found on Sally Anne Bowman's body. At the time of that earlier case, the victim had been too traumatized to complete a facial sketch, but now she was calm enough to assist police. With the support of psychologists and facial identification technicians, she described the attacker's features in detail, allowing the new E-fit to be produced with greater accuracy than ever before. After receiving approval from Sally Ann's family, police determined that the public needed to understand just how dangerous this man was. They organized a large, live broadcast press conference where officers presented updates on the investigation, unveiled the new E-fit composite, and urged people across the city to come forward with any information that could help. After the press conference, hundreds of calls and tips from the public began flooding into the police station. Many claimed to have seen the man depicted in the E-fatigue composite, but as investigators followed up on each lead, every single one turned into a dead end. The hope that had briefly flickered was quickly extinguished, and police found themselves almost back at square one, until fate led them to an entirely unexpected turning point. About 20 miles from Croydon, in the town of Crawley, a small pub was hosting a live screening of the World Cup match between England and Trinidad and Tobago that evening. Amid the lively atmosphere, a 35-year-old man named Mark Dixie was drinking with friends. After consuming quite a bit of alcohol, he began arguing with another patron, and the disagreement quickly escalated into a physical altercation. The two men spilled out onto the street, where security cameras captured the entire fight. At that moment, a passing patrol officer happened to be nearby, immediately stepped in, and broke up the brawl. Dixie was restrained and taken to the station for questioning on charges of disorderly conduct. There, he appeared highly emotional, even breaking down in tears during the interview, despite the fact that the incident itself was a relatively minor offense. Following standard procedure after the Crawley altercation, Mark Dixie's fingerprints and DNA were taken for record-keeping before he was released on bail. At the time, No one could have imagined that this routine DNA sample would turn out to be the key to solving one of the most shocking cases in modern British history. 12 days later, the phone rang inside the command office of the Sally Anne Bowman investigation team. On the other end was a representative from the Forensic Science Service, bringing news that left the entire room in stunned silence. Mark Dixie's DNA matched perfectly with the sample recovered from Sally Anne Bowman's body. After nearly 9 months of relentless investigation, police had finally uncovered the identity of the man they had been searching for. A nationwide arrest warrant was issued immediately, but when officers traced his whereabouts, Dixie had already left the United Kingdom. He had fled to Amsterdam, the capital of the Netherlands, intending to stay hidden for a long time. For 3 months, he lived quietly there, renting a room in a rundown building and taking on odd jobs. However, after an argument with his landlord, he was evicted and forced to return to England. Upon his return, Dixie resumed working as a cook at the same pub where he had previously been employed. As police conducted surveillance around the building where Mark Dixie worked, they discovered a small side entrance to the pub, a perfect spot to carry out the arrest discreetly. But before the plan could be finalized, the kitchen door suddenly opened, and Dixie himself stepped outside. The officers immediately moved in and restrained him. The arrest was swift, no shouting, no resistance. One of the officers involved later recalled that as he placed his hand on Dixie's chest to stop him from running, he could feel the man's heartbeat, steady, calm, completely unshaken. "What haunts me," he said, "is how unnervingly calm he was, as if nothing unusual was happening." After being handcuffed and taken to the police station, Dixie remained silent. When he was booked into the holding cell, he muttered only one chilling sentence: "I must have been out of my mind when I did it." The next day, Mark Dixie was formally charged with the killing of Sally Anne Bowman. He said nothing as the indictment was read aloud. At the same time, the family liaison officer, Graham Bannatyne, called Linda Bowman around 9:00 p.m. He spoke gently, asking if he could come over to talk in person. When Linda opened the door, he looked her straight in the eyes and said the words the Bowman family had waited nearly a year to hear: "We've got him." For them, it was the moment justice finally began to take shape, even though nothing could ever fill the void Sally Anne had left behind. So who exactly was Mark Dixie, and how had he managed to evade justice for so many years? Born in 1970 in Streatham, South London, Dixie had a deeply troubled childhood. His parents divorced when he was just 18 months old, and after his mother remarried, he took his stepfather's surname, becoming Mark James MacDonald. Throughout his life, he used several aliases, including Mark Philip Dixie, Mark James Down, Stephen MacDonald, and Shane Turner, which made tracking his criminal record far more difficult. Having grown up in unstable conditions and spending time in foster care, Dixie turned to crime at an early age. Before DNA sampling became mandatory, he had already built up a long list of offenses. In 1986, he used a dangerous weapon to rob a woman in Stockwell and was sentenced to 6 weeks in jail. A year later, he was again convicted of robbery, and in 1988, he received a 2-year sentence for a serious assault causing injury. The following year, In 1989, he was convicted of public indecency and ordered to complete 80 hours of community service. In 1990, Dixie assaulted a police officer and was once again convicted. What shocked investigators even more was that his string of offenses was not limited to the United Kingdom. In 1993, he moved to Australia, overstayed his visa, and quickly reoffended, marking the beginning of another series of crimes abroad. In 1998, while living in Perth, Australia, Mark Dixie committed one of the most serious offenses in his criminal history. The victim was a 19-year-old Thai student who lived alone in a small house. Late one night, she heard strange noises coming from the kitchen and went to investigate, only to come face to face with a man wearing a stocking mask and holding a sharp object. It was Dixie. He attacked her violently, leaving her seriously injured and unconscious, then committed a severe assault before stealing valuables from her home and fleeing. Fortunately, the young woman survived the horrific ordeal, but only a few months later, he struck again. On New Year's Day in 1999, while driving through the Bunbury area, a few hours from Perth, Dixie spotted a young woman jogging along the roadside. He stopped his car, hid in the bushes, and suddenly jumped out to block her path, demanding that she do what he said. Thankfully, the incident was interrupted before he could cause further harm. 3 days later, he was fined 750 Australian dollars, a shockingly lenient punishment for such dangerous behavior. By April 1999, because of his expired visa and criminal history, Dixie was deported from Australia and sent back to England. After Mark Dixie was formally charged with the killing of Sally Anne Bowman, the police's work was only just beginning. Over the next 18 months, the investigative team meticulously pieced together every detail of his movements on the night of September 24th, 2005, to understand the method, motive, and circumstances that led to the crime. They needed an airtight case, one strong enough to convince the jury of his true danger. Through interviews with friends and acquaintances, detectives established that on that very night, Dixie had gone out to celebrate his own birthday, the same night Sally Anne, just a few streets away, was enjoying a night out with friends. He spent the evening at a pub on Brighton Road, only a few hundred yards from Blenheim Crescent, where Sally Anne lived. For Dixie, birthdays were always volatile occasions. Those who knew him said he often became unpredictable, irritable, and craved attention on that day. That evening, his girlfriend did not join him, which seemed to further unsettle him. At the pub, he repeatedly called her, but when he returned to the table, his friends noticed a complete change. He had grown silent, scowling, and appeared to be suppressing a rising anger. He kept drinking heavily and used illegal substances, clouding his judgment even more. When the pub closed, Dixie left with 2 female friends and headed to Avondale Road, where he planned to spend the night, a location only a few hundred yards from Sally Anne Bowman's home. The 2 women in the house on Avondale Road went to sleep in the early hours of the morning, but Mark Dixie remained awake. Based on evidence and witness statements, police believe he left the house sometime between 2:30 and 3:30 a.m. When he stepped outside, he was carrying a sharp object, likely with the intent of finding a woman to attack. From the timeline and location data, investigators concluded that Dixie was the same man who had assaulted the woman on Sanderstead Road just an hour earlier, but had been interrupted before he could carry out his intentions. Frustrated and still under the influence of alcohol and drugs, he wandered toward the nearby Blenheim Crescent area. It was there that Sally Anne Bowman, the young woman standing right in front of her own home, just a few steps away from safety, tragically crossed paths with him. One fateful moment, the wrong time, the wrong place, and an irreversible tragedy unfolded. According to police theory, after attacking Sally Anne Bowman, Mark Dixie did not leave the scene right away. Instead, he hid in the darkness nearby, watching to see if anyone had heard the noise or come out to investigate. But Blenheim Crescent remained completely silent. No lights turned on. No doors opened. No sound broke the stillness. Believing he had gone unnoticed, Dixie didn't realize that a nearby witness had heard Sally Ann scream and was quietly peering through their window into the dark street. The witness later reported seeing a tall man walking slowly back toward the spot where Sally Ann lay. Police believed that man was Mark Dixie. Thinking no one had seen him, he returned to the scene, assaulted the victim, and then calmly walked away as if nothing had happened. Afterward, he went back to the house on Avondale Road, where the two women were still asleep, and lay down on the sofa, drifting off as if the night had been ordinary. The next morning, he behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. During the expanded investigation, British police coordinated with Australian authorities to cross-check international records, and the findings left them stunned. Dixie's DNA matched the case of the Thai student who had been attacked in Perth in the late 1990s. On February 5, 2008, Mark Dixie formally stood trial at the Old Bailey in London. During the proceedings, the Thai woman took the stand and testified, confirming that Dixie was the man who had seriously injured and assaulted her in 1998. His demeanor in court was chilling, detached, expressionless, and almost devoid of emotion. Although he was not formally charged in the Australian case, the DNA evidence, which matched biological traces found on the victim's belongings, reinforced the portrait of a deeply dangerous offender. Mark Dixie's defense left the entire courtroom stunned. He admitted to having committed a serious assault against Sally Anne Bowman and to leaving his DNA on her body. Yet he stubbornly insisted that he was not the one responsible for her death. According to his testimony, that night he had happened to come across a young woman whom he believed was drunk and unconscious, and he took advantage of the situation to assault her. He tried to distance himself from the responsibility for Sally Ann's death, claiming that the real killer is still out there. However, he was never able to explain why his DNA matched perfectly with all the evidence found at the scene, nor could he offer any reasonable justification for his disturbing history of violent behavior. When the closing arguments ended, the jury took little time to reach a decision. The verdict was unanimous. Mark Dixie was guilty. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 34 years, one of the longest sentences ever handed down to a single offender in the United Kingdom. This sentence meant that before he could even be considered for parole, Dixie would be at least 70 years old and likely would never again walk free under the light of day. After being sentenced to life imprisonment, Mark Dixie began serving his time at Belmarsh Prison, a Category A facility that houses some of the most dangerous offenders in the United Kingdom. However, because many inmates expressed hostility toward him and repeatedly threatened to attack him, Dixie was transferred to Long Lartin Prison, another high-security institution. By 2014, he was moved yet again to HMP Franklin for safety reasons, as authorities sought to protect him from potential revenge attacks by other prisoners. Detective Chief Inspector Chris Lepere, who had worked on the investigation, described Dixie as one of the most chilling and cold-hearted individuals I have ever encountered in my entire career. The case of Sally Anne Bowman also sparked a nationwide debate about the importance of the DNA database system. Her mother, Linda Bowman, became a strong advocate for the establishment of a mandatory national DNA registry. She believed that if such a database had existed at the time Sally Anne was killed, police could have identified the perpetrator in less than 24 hours, and Sally Anne's ex-boyfriend, Louis Sproston, would never have suffered days of wrongful suspicion. Detective Chief Inspector Stuart Cundy, who led the investigation, agreed completely. A national DNA database, if managed with the right safeguards, could have helped us identify the offender in just one day. Instead, it took nearly 9 months for justice to be served. Although the proposal gained significant public support, many politicians and government ministers rejected it, arguing that a mandatory DNA system would infringe on personal privacy and civil liberties. Even so, in January 2015, after years of denial, Mark Dixie finally confessed that he was the one responsible for the tragedy of Sally Anne Bowman. By 2017, Mark Dixie's criminal record had continued to expand as he faced additional charges, and it was then that a deeply disturbing truth came to light. An innocent man had once been imprisoned in his place. In 2003, a Dutch citizen named Romano van der Dusen was convicted of assaulting 3 women in the Costa del Sol region of Spain. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison and, during that time, suffered constant abuse from other inmates who believed he was a sexual predator. However, the truth later revealed that the real perpetrator behind those attacks was none other than Mark Dixie, who was still free at the time. In June 2015, a Dutch newspaper reported that Dixie had confessed to one of the 3 assaults, though he continued to deny the other 2. Romano van der Dusen was eventually exonerated and released from prison in 2016. A year later, he attended Southwark Crown Court on November 24, 2017, when Mark Dixie received 2 additional life sentences for the assaults of 2 other women in Croydon. Investigators also uncovered that Dixie's pattern of violence dated back to when he was only 16 years old. He confessed to attacking a woman in the Wandle Road car park in 1987, tying her hands, gagging her, and then setting her car on fire. According to the presiding judge, he seemed to take pleasure in the sheer terror of his victim. Afterward, he stole her credit card information and later called her home at night to mock her, even calling again the next evening, leaving the victim so traumatized that she eventually left the city to live in isolation in the countryside. During the expanded investigation, Mark Dixie went on to confess to yet another serious attack. In 2002, he assaulted a woman on Selston Road. He struck her hard on the head with the handle of a kitchen knife, then dragged her to a secluded area where he committed a violent assault. On her way home, the victim managed to leave several voicemail messages for her boyfriend, but in the final recording, only her terrified scream and the sound of the phone hitting the ground could be heard. The attack ended when a nearby resident heard her cries for help and shouted threats, scaring Dixie into running away. shockingly. Afterward, he used the victim's phone to call her boyfriend, boasting and mocking him about what he had done. The woman was taken to the hospital with multiple skull fractures and required long-term treatment. When questioned about the assault, Dixie's response infuriated investigators. He coldly remarked, "It could have been worse." By 2017, when the court officially sentenced him for these crimes, Detective Chris Lepere, who had also been part of the Sally Anne Bowman investigation, stated, "I hope today's verdict brings some measure of closure to those women. Thanks to advances in forensic science, we were finally able to link Dixie to these cases and bring him to justice." For the Bowman family, although nothing could ever bring Sally Anne back, they expressed their deep gratitude to the investigative team, especially to Family Liaison Officer Graham Bannatyne, who had stood by them through the long, painful, but determined journey to seek justice for their daughter. The damage Mark Dixie left behind is immeasurable. He destroyed countless lives, spread fear among women, caused an innocent man to be wrongfully imprisoned, and shattered the happiness of an entire family. For the Bowmans, the pain of losing Sally Anne will never fade. Her sister, Michelle, tearfully shared, "There are mornings when you wake up, and for a brief moment, everything feels peaceful. Life seems perfect, just like it used to be. And then suddenly, boom, the reality hits you, and everything falls apart." She said that every night before closing her eyes. She feels afraid of what she might dream about, whether it will be the happy, lively Sally Anne she once knew, or the haunting image she can never erase from the investigation photos. "The nightmares never stop," Michelle said, "and nothing in this world can make them easier, because my sister is never coming back." For the Bowman family, the pain is more than loss. It is a lifelong wound that will forever mark their hearts. On September 11th, 2008, on what would have been Sally Anne Bowman's 21st birthday, her family, friends, and many residents of Croydon gathered in central Croydon, just outside the Primark store on North End, for a deeply emotional memorial. White balloons were released into the sky, symbolizing freedom, youth, and the dreams of an 18-year-old girl whose life had stopped far too soon. Linda Bowman shared that the ceremony was not only to remember Sally Anne, but also to remind everyone that the love for her had never faded. However, the Bowman family's heartbreak did not end there. In August 2017, they revealed that Sally Anne's ashes had been exhumed and relocated 4 years earlier after her grave had been repeatedly targeted by vandals. It was a devastating decision, but one they were forced to make to protect their daughter's final resting place, the resting place of a young woman who had come to symbolize courage, justice, and the enduring strength of those left behind. The story of Sally Anne Bowman is a painful reminder of how fragile life can be and how important it is to protect ourselves in a world still filled with hidden dangers. She was a young woman with dreams, talent, and a bright future, all of which were stolen in a single fleeting moment. This case also shows the power of forensic science and justice. Though delayed, the truth eventually came to light. Every story in the true crime documentary series is not just about crime, but also a wake-up call for us to stay alert, grow stronger, and never lose faith in justice. Thank you for staying with us until the end of today's story. Please share this video, leave a comment to honor Sally Anne Bowman, And don't forget to subscribe and hit like so we can continue bringing you more episodes that tell the truth with respect for the victims. See you in the next episode of True Crime Documentary, where every story reminds us that justice, though delayed, will never be silent.